morning. Welcome. I think welcome back to some of you, and welcome to day 2, our day on data and information for the Breaking Barriers Symposium 2020. I'm so glad that you're here. We have many distinct pleasures of the morning planned for you, and the first is a conversation with Heather Hough. I'm so delighted that Heather agreed to participate with us today. She's even more of a policy wonk than I am. And I'm Maureen Burness, one of the planning members of Breaking Barriers. So I'd like to introduce Heather to you. Heather Hough is the Executive Director of PACE. Prior to serving in this role, she led the partnership between PACE and the core districts. And she's going to tell you more about her work and particularly her focus on data. Her recent work has focused on using research to strengthen state structures, supporting continuous improvement, and to advance policies that support the whole child, which is why our hearts are in sync so well together. Dr. Hough has worked in a variety of capacities to support policy and practice in education, including as an improvement advisor at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and a researcher at the Public Policy Institute of California, the Center for Education Policy Analysis at Stanford University, and the Center for Education Policy at SRI International. Dr. Hough holds a PhD in education policy and a BA in public policy from Stanford University. And I am absolutely delighted to have you here with us today, Heather. Thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Maureen. Reading out my credentials makes me really sound like a policy wonk. So I appreciate that. I am so pleased to be here today to kick off the day with a topic that is very dear to me, and that is the importance of data in serving the whole child. As Maureen said, I'm Heather Hough. I'm the Director of Policy Analysis for California Education, or PACE. We're a partnership of multiple California universities, and our mission is to improve education policy and practice and advance equity through evidence. I've worked for many years on the topic of data and on the topic of using data to serve the whole child, helping educators and policymakers improve outcomes for students, developing new measures for understanding students' social emotional needs and their experiences, and analyzing data to understand and document places where student needs are not being met or places where they are, and we can learn from it. And so for me, this issue has taken on added importance right now as we're in the midst of a pandemic that has really laid bare a lot of our issues as a state and dependence on data, and also the needs of the whole child. So we've known for some time that students can't learn unless their basic needs are met. They need to feel safe, they need to be fed, they need all of these things in order to be ready to learn. And here in the pandemic, where we've really don't have the settings that we used to have, we don't have school and home and community. Now all of these things are kind of blended. And so this whole child need has been put in the forefront. As most students in California are still learning virtually, they're learning from home, and schools aren't able to provide the kinds of resources and supports that they did before. We're now seeing that that home environment is so important, and also that all of student needs are critical to how they're able to learn. In the pandemic, it's if they don't have computers or Wi-Fi, they can't learn. But also we know that students have really difficult conditions sometimes in their homes. In the most dire cases, they are experiencing trauma, as issues of poverty, housing and food insecurity, or even abuse are compounded by grief and loss. And we know that the health impact is also varying across the state, with some of our most vulnerable populations, our Black students, our Latinx students, being hit hardest by the pandemic. And some of these students also experiencing a heightened awareness over racial inequality. So this is the context in which we are right now. And I think there's a growing awareness, not just amongst educators who've known how important these things are to student learning, but among the public, and an awareness of how much schools contribute to this whole child. I think that the issue of meal delivery service, for example, when the pandemic struck, was something that not everyone in the public understood oh, there's many kids who don't eat if they don't come into school buildings. And so as we think about how we rebuild from this crisis, it has to be with thinking about the student as a whole child, all of the needs and assets that they bring into the classroom. How do our systems support those children? And this is going to be a long problem that we're going to be recovering from. We know that students are really struggling with mental health issues, as are their parents. And we are already experiencing and seeing in our schools a huge issue around what we call learning loss. Students are not on track, and the students that are least on track are the ones that we know are the most vulnerable. So looking into the future, we know that these are not problems that schools alone can solve. It's not fair to look at a school and say, okay, it's your job to feed kids and make sure their families have housing and that their mental health needs are met, and so on and so on and so on. These are coordinated problems that require coordinated solutions. We have to break down the barriers to make sure that students are getting the things that they need in the really coordinated fashion in which they need them, because nobody likes to feel like, oh, for that question, you go here, and for that question, you go there. And in my mind, data is a critical aspect of this integration. We know through decades of research that what you measure matters. How you choose to report student experiences, agency outcomes, student outcomes, that drives the ways that we think about how we serve students and also how we hold our institutions accountable. And so I'm going to talk for just a second about data and what the power of data, because we've also seen in the pandemic what happens when we don't have it. In the spring, when the pandemic struck, we stopped collecting student attendance data because students weren't in physical school. We didn't administer our annual state tests. In the core districts where we have a partnership at PACE, they do an annual survey on student social emotional learning and school culture climate. They also weren't able to do those data collections. And so we've, for many months now, as an educational system, been completely blind. We don't know how students are achieving. We don't know what the learning loss really looks like at scale. We don't know which students are participating, if they're engaged, if they're safe. And then in a kind of person-to-person way, we also know that rates of rates of abuse and neglect may be up in homes, but that rates of reporting are down because people in schools aren't seeing students and being able to diagnose those needs. And so I think if part of the pandemic has underscored the importance of the whole child, I think the other thing that the pandemic has underscored is the importance of data. We need to work now to make sure that we are investing in the data systems that help us recover from this pandemic. And that data can be used at multiple levels. It can be moved at a classroom or school level so that people know what services is this child already receiving? How is this child performing? And what can we do to help? And that at a system level, the data can help us understand where we need to invest additional resources and where we can learn from bright spots in our system. So our governor has already made an investment in the Cradle to Career data system, which has a vision of building this integrated data set that serves these multiple purposes. And now is the time to really continue to invest in that, as we know that the pandemic has brought us unprecedented levels of student need, and we need the data to be able to chart the course. So I will end there with my comments, and I would like to remind everybody to click to the next session to start the live stream. Please enjoy today's proceedings, and thank you again for having me.